My CEO fired me after 20 years, so I took down his entire company without breaking a sweat, and then I was brushing my teeth when the video came through. Mason sent it at 1:12 in the morning, and all he wrote was, "You should probably see this before Monday." For a second I thought it might be a joke, or maybe some client gossip, but the second I saw the opening frame, Greg's face lit by overhead bar lights, a whiskey in his hand, I felt something cold sink into my gut. It wasn't just the sight of him at the company's 20th anniversary party. It was the tone of his voice, the way he laughed with his shoulders like he owned the world, like he'd already forgotten the camera was even there. "Next month, we'll have a new face in her seat, and she won't see it coming," he said, laughing louder than everyone else around him. "Nora still thinks she's untouchable. She's not. She's just too slow to realize she's already out." The camera swayed a little, someone's hand shaking, and the crowd around him didn't even flinch. One guy chuckled nervously, another just stared into his drink, and a few of them kept nodding like they'd heard all this before. I didn't hear anyone object. No one said a single word in my defense. Not after nearly 2 decades of being the first one in and the last one out. Not after missing birthdays, holidays, weekends, and too many goddamn Sunday mornings buried in decks and pivot tables so Greg wouldn't embarrass himself on a client call. I watched the video 3 times, then 4. Each time, his voice hit a little different. Smug, confident, like I was a problem he'd already solved, like I was a leftover takeout box he was finally tossing out. And the thing that burned the most? He wasn't even hiding it. He knew people were watching, and he didn't care. After 19 years of defending that man's decisions, cleaning up his public gaffes, and pushing back on clients who saw right through him, he really thought I'd be blindsided. He thought I'd walk in Monday morning like a loyal fool and let him stab me through the ribs in a glass office full of witnesses. I didn't sleep that night. I just stared at the ceiling, chewing through every memory like it might offer up a reason, some justification, some crack in the foundation I hadn't noticed until it was too late. But there was nothing, just the echo of his words, just the slow boil rising in my throat. By the time my alarm went off at 6:15, I'd already made a decision. I was going to walk into that building like nothing had happened, smile at the front desk guy, bring my coffee in the ugly travel mug no one liked, take notes in meetings, nod like I always did. But underneath it all, I'd be pulling every wire out of the wall while Greg smiled like a man with no idea the storm was already inside the house. When I walked in at 7:55, he was already in his office with Mark, the CFO. The two of them were talking like frat boys who hadn't aged gracefully, half laughing, half whispering about someone's expense report or some intern with a short skirt. I knocked once on the doorframe and said, "Morning." My voice was as polite as it had ever been. Greg glanced over his shoulder, his eyes catching mine for barely a second. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd flinch, or at least hesitate. But no, just the same fake smirk I'd seen for years. "Morning, Nora," he said. "Good weekend." I nodded. Restful. Ready for a productive month. He laughed, like he had some punchline only he knew. "That's what I like to hear." "Sure it is." The rest of the day passed without incident, which was fitting because everything about Greg's plan was designed to feel clean. He thought he'd get HR to handle the hard part. He'd sit behind that desk and toss out the same script I'd watched him use on others. Restructuring, shifting budget priorities, unfortunate timing. I was supposed to walk out quietly with a box and a folder full of severance paperwork while he leaned back and scheduled dinner reservations like he hadn't just gutted another department. Instead, I started collecting. Quietly. Thoroughly. I pulled everything I could find. Old client contracts, internal reports, financials, the decks I'd written but he'd taken credit for. I had access to more than he realized, and I made sure to copy only what was legal, only what I'd had a hand in. I knew the policy by heart, having drafted half of it myself during the compliance review last fall. Mason, bless him, didn't say another word about the video. But he didn't need to. His silence was better than an apology. He kept his head down, but I saw the way he glanced over sometimes, like he was waiting for me to snap. But I didn't. I played the part. I brought donuts on Friday. I stayed late to review budgets. I even laughed at Greg's recycled jokes during the all-hands meeting. I also started calling people. Carefully. Strategically. The ones who had always worked with me directly. The ones who knew I was the real reason their accounts had stayed smooth. I didn't pitch anything. I didn't say I was leaving. I just asked how things were going and said I was thinking about the next chapter. That was all it took. Doors opened. Calendars cleared. Suddenly, my Mondays were twice as busy, and none of that time showed up on my time card. Then I called someone I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Julian. He ran a firm in Chicago, Weldon Shore, and we danced around an offer once before, back when Greg had promised me a promotion that never came. Julian was cautious, but intrigued. If you're really serious this time, he said, I've got a conference room with your name on it. I didn't commit, not yet. I wanted leverage, not loyalty. But I told him I'd send him something soon. Something he'd want to see. Back at the office, the mood started to shift. Not for Greg, of course. He was as smug as ever. But people were watching me more closely. HR stopped by my desk twice in 1 week to check in. My laptop permissions started getting glitchy. The writing was on the wall, and they were getting ready to scrub it clean. Let them. I had everything I needed. And soon, Greg was going to realize that firing me wasn't the end of the game. It was the start of the avalanche. The thing about people like Greg is that they never expect you to fight back. They expect you to fold. He'd built his whole career on the assumption that people like me would just grit our teeth, accept the scraps, and quietly fade into the shadows when told to. What he never counted on was that I'd spent 19 years studying him more closely than he ever studied anything. I knew every deal he'd fumbled, every metric he inflated, and every client he'd nearly lost. Until I came in and fixed it. I spent the next 3 weeks executing every piece of my plan in near silence. I kept my calendar clean and visible, made sure every internal meeting was documented, and double-checked every file I touched. But behind the scenes, I was collecting proof, carefully and methodically, like an archaeologist uncovering a ruin. I didn't just want to leave. I wanted to make it impossible for him to rebuild after I was gone. Julian had sent a secure upload link after our first call. I waited until Sunday night, then sent him a locked zip folder with 3 sample case files, redacted, of course, but enough to prove I wasn't bluffing. His reply came back within the hour. Let's talk tomorrow. In person. I booked a same-day ticket to Chicago for the following week. I told the office I was visiting my sister. No one questioned it. Meanwhile, I ramped up my calls with old clients. Just friendly conversations at first, nothing suspicious. I asked how their current projects were running and if they were satisfied with the level of service lately. The responses were lukewarm at best. Apparently, once I stopped shielding Greg's incompetence, the cracks started showing quickly. One of our longest-standing clients, a manufacturing conglomerate out of Denver, even told me they were considering alternative consultancies. I didn't even have to pitch myself. They were already halfway out the door. Greg, for his part, was getting more smug by the day. Every morning, he greeted me with this fake warmth that made my skin crawl. Still with us, Nora? He'd chuckle, as if he expected me to just vanish midweek. I smiled every single time and said something like, where else would I be? Because I wanted him confident. I wanted him unprepared. I wanted him laughing right up until he realized he'd stepped onto a landmine. The HR meeting was scheduled for a Thursday at 3:30 p.m. I got the invite that morning. Subject line, transition discussion. Denise from HR sent it. I knew her well. She wasn't cruel, just complicit. She played neutral like it paid better. When I walked into Greg's office, she was already sitting across from him with the manila folder open and waiting. His expression was somewhere between pity and pride, like he'd finally gotten rid of an old piece of furniture he never liked. Nora, he said, motioning for me to sit. Thanks for taking the time today. I sat down without a word. First, I want to say thank you for everything you've done here. He gave me the same speech I'd heard him give 3 other people this year. We're restructuring, he said. Industry pressures, revenue trends, all of that. Denise slid the folder toward me like it contained a winning lottery ticket. We're offering you a very generous package. This includes health coverage for 90 days, continued access to our career services. I didn't touch it. I didn't blink. I just waited. He paused, clearly uncomfortable with how calm I was being. Of course, we'll need your laptop and badge by end of day, he added. And you'll need to sign the NDA. That part made me smile. He really thought he could gag me on my way out the door. Instead, I looked him dead in the eyes and said, just to confirm, this decision is final? He blinked. Yes, it is. Perfect, I said, and I picked up the folder, tucked it under my arm, and stood. Greg looked relieved. I could tell he thought it was over, that I'd walk out, maybe cry in my car, and disappear into the fog of the company's alumni list. But I wasn't finished. I was just getting started. I spent the next 2 hours doing exactly what they expected, packing up my office, clearing my desk, smiling politely at the curious stares from coworkers. But on my laptop, I was archiving everything I legally had access to: client rosters, contracts I'd personally negotiated, project timelines with my initials all over them. And then, just before I shut down my email, I sent one last message to Dorian, the COO of that massive Denver client. Subject line: availability. The body of the message was short but pointed. I thanked him for the collaboration, let him know I was moving into consulting, and said I'd be happy to talk future projects. That email was the fuse. Greg just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I left my phone on silent while I made breakfast. By 10 a.m., I had 4 missed calls from the office. By noon, a text from Mason: whatever you did, it's chaos here. Dorian just pulled the plug. Greg's in meltdown mode. I almost choked on my coffee. That fast. I hadn't expected it to move quite so quickly, but apparently, Greg's kingdom was more fragile than I thought. I imagined him pacing his office, barking into the phone, scrambling to find a way to spin the loss. But there was no spin. There was just the truth. I had been the reason that account stayed afloat. Without me, there was nothing keeping them loyal. At 2:30 p.m., my phone rang again. Unknown number. I didn't even have to look. I knew it was Greg. I picked up and waited. Nora, he said, trying to sound casual. I heard from Dorian. So did I replied. He mentioned you reached out, Greg said, like he was trying to catch me in a lie. I did. There was a long pause on his end. Look, I think there's been some confusion. He seemed to think you're, working independently now, that you might be unavailable to support the transition. I let that sit for a moment before answering. Greg, you called me a relic who wouldn't see it coming. Why are you surprised that I was ready? Silence. Just his breath through the line. Then he said, quieter now, that video wasn't meant to be taken seriously. I laughed. That's the problem. You never take anything seriously until it's burning down around you. He tried to recover. Are you working with someone? I think we can still work something out if... No, I cut in. There's nothing to work out. You made your decision. Now you get to live with it. By 4 p.m., I was sitting in Julian's office in downtown Chicago. He shook my hand with a grin that said everything he didn't have to. I heard things moved faster than expected, he said, sliding a folder across the table. These are the terms we discussed. You'll come in as a partner. Flexible hours. Profit share. And of course, the client leads you're bringing. Those are gold. I opened the folder, skimmed the numbers, and smiled. Let's make it official. Greg still had no idea what was coming next. But he would. Soon. Monday came with storm clouds and coffee that tasted like burnt hope. I was already awake before sunrise, scrolling through emails from new contacts and client leads, and watching Greg's world begin to rot from the inside. The first domino had fallen, and the chain reaction wasn't waiting around. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Mason texted me again. You would not believe the panic in here. Greg looks like he hasn't slept in a week. Half the staff is whispering like someone died. I didn't respond immediately. I just watched from the quiet of my apartment as the panic accelerated into collapse. By 9 o'clock, 2 more clients had walked away. One of them hadn't even sent a warning, just a single-line email terminating their contract effective immediately. Legal scrambled to find loopholes. Finance started running projections like buckets under a leaking ceiling, but the numbers weren't getting better. If anything, they were unraveling faster than anyone could process. Greg was apparently making phone calls to anyone who'd ever been on a holiday card list, desperate to control the narrative before someone else did. But it was already too late. No one trusted him anymore. The illusion was shattered. People were finally seeing what I'd kept hidden for years, that Greg had never actually known what he was doing. He had just coasted on other people's expertise, and I had been his biggest crutch. By lunchtime, Mark, the CFO, had gone silent. Mason said he hadn't come out of his office since early morning and was seen reviewing contract terms like a man trying to find religion in fine print. There were rumors flying through every hallway about investors calling emergency meetings, about a possible leadership shakeup, and even a whispered mention that the board had already started discussing contingency plans that didn't include Greg at the helm. At 12:04 p.m., my phone rang again. Same number as before. I picked up and said nothing. Nora. Greg's voice cracked like he was chewing glass. I don't know what the hell you've been telling people, but we've got a serious problem. I waited a few seconds before answering. What kind of problem, Greg? I could practically hear the sweat in his voice. Miller's out. And now I've lost Baines and Riley too. That's millions of dollars in contracts. Just gone. And the worst part is, they all cited you in some way. That you were no longer there. That you were the reason they signed on in the first place. I let the silence stretch long enough to make him squirm. That's unfortunate, I finally said. But I don't work for you anymore, remember? He ignored the jab, tried to pivot. Look, maybe we rushed things. Maybe this whole transition was premature. If there's anything you need, you don't get to walk that back. I cut in. You made your move. Now you deal with the consequences. There was a pause so heavy I could almost see him sagging into his chair. Then came the predictable threat, as tired and limp as I expected. You know, this industry is smaller than people realize. You burn the wrong bridges. Greg, I interrupted. You lit that bridge on fire yourself the second you stood in front of your staff and called me a deadweight to be replaced. His breath caught at that. He knew I wasn't bluffing. That video wasn't some distant ghost haunting a hard drive. It was a match I hadn't even struck yet. That same afternoon, I met with Julian and his executive team in a second-floor boardroom overlooking Lake Michigan. They already had draft proposals in place for 3 of the accounts I'd helped pry loose from Greg's grip. Julian didn't even try to contain his enthusiasm. This isn't just a win, he said, thumbing through the printouts. This is a shift in the market. They didn't just leave Carter and Associates. They followed you here. You realize what that means? I did. It meant I was no longer someone else's hidden strength. I was the brand now. The trust, the relationship, the expertise, none of it had ever belonged to Greg. It had always been mine. By the time Thursday hit, I received word that 2 more clients were in negotiation with Weldon Shore. They hadn't signed yet, but they'd already pulled their renewals off the table. Greg was drowning, and every stroke he made just pulled more water into his lungs. Friday morning, Mason sent a final update that sealed the moment. Emergency board meeting at 3. Talk of removing Greg. Investors are in full freakout mode. That was it. That was the crack widening into collapse. The people who'd once believed in him, who'd defended his arrogance as confidence, were now throwing him under the bus before he took them down with him. But I wasn't finished yet. That night, I returned to the building one final time. Not as an employee, not as a guest, just a ghost walking through the ruins she helped build. The receptionist recognized me, but didn't stop me. The elevator hummed its usual tune, and as I stepped off on the executive floor, I noticed how quiet everything had become. There were no side conversations, no laughing in the break room, just silence and the low hum of anxiety vibrating through every light fixture. I walked straight to Greg's office and knocked once. "Come in," he said, voice flat and frayed. When he looked up and saw me, his shoulders tensed. He didn't smile. He didn't stand. His tie was half undone, and his eyes were rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that clings to failure like a second skin. I closed the door behind me and took the same chair I'd once sat in the day he fired me. "How's it going, Greg?" I asked lightly, as if we were old friends meeting over coffee. He snorted, bitter. "You already know how it's going." I watched him for a beat, then tilted my head. "And yet you still thought I was replaceable." He didn't answer. Instead, he let out a long sigh and said the last thing I ever expected to hear from him. "If there's a way to fix this, to make it right, just tell me what it is." Oh, there it was. The plea. The first true crack in the porcelain mask. I stood slowly, adjusting my blazer. Greg, there is no fixing this. You don't even understand what you broke. His eyes darkened. You think you've won? I turned toward the door, then looked back one last time. I don't think I've won, Greg. I know I have. And I left him sitting there, alone in the very empire he'd built on borrowed loyalty and stolen credit, watching it all crumble around him. The following morning felt like the calm before a storm I had personally designed to tear open the sky. I sat in my new office overlooking the skyline, sipping the strongest coffee I could make while reading the early headlines breaking across the industry feeds. Major client exodus hits Carter Associates amid executive shakeup. Confidence wavers as consulting giant struggles to retain partnerships. Sources suggest CEO may be removed following revenue collapse. It was happening faster than I thought, and far louder than Greg ever imagined possible. By 9 a.m., the buzz from the Sterling floor was electric. Julian stopped by briefly to share the morning numbers with a smile that barely hid his satisfaction. You took half their spine in 1 week, he said, tossing a printout of the newest account that had signed with us. By next quarter, they'll be a ghost of their former self, and everyone will know why. But it wasn't just about revenge anymore. Something had shifted in me since that first phone call with Greg, since the moment I realized the industry no longer owned me. I wasn't cleaning up someone else's mess anymore. I was making moves for myself, carving out a place that didn't require shrinking to fit someone else's ego. At 10:17, Mason texted again. You will not believe what just happened. I barely finished reading the message before the next one came. Board meeting just ended. Greg's out. Effective immediately. I read it twice, letting the words sink in like cold water down my spine. I had expected it, had even planned for it, but the confirmation still hit like thunder. The official announcement came in the form of a dry corporate memo. Effective immediately, Gregory has stepped down as Chief Executive Officer of Carter Associates. An interim leadership team will be appointed, with further updates to follow in the coming weeks. I forwarded it to Julian without a word. He replied in under a minute. He fell faster than I thought. Beautiful work. Still, I wasn't prepared for what came later that afternoon. My assistant knocked once before opening the door, her face unreadable. Nora, someone's here to see you. I told him you were in a meeting, but he insists it's urgent. I looked up, already knowing. Who is it? He said his name is Greg. There it was. I let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. Send him in. A few seconds later, Greg stepped through the door. Though he looked less like a CEO and more like a man who had been dragged through the collapse of his own reputation. His suit was wrinkled, his face blotchy, and for the first time in my life, he didn't have that smug expression carved into his mouth like a brand. He didn't sit. He stood awkwardly near the door, glancing around like he couldn't believe the size of the office he was now standing in. Finally, he spoke. You really did it. I tilted my head and looked at him without blinking. Did what, Greg? His jaw twitched. Destroyed me. I didn't answer right away because I didn't need to. He already knew the truth, and the fact that he was standing here at all meant he knew I was the one who held the power now. I underestimated you, he said finally, his voice quiet. I see that now. I nodded once. Yes, you did. Another silence stretched between us, and then, almost choking on the words, he said something so absurd I almost laughed. I need a job. I don't know what stunned me more, the audacity or the desperation in his voice when he said it. He, who had ridiculed me behind my back. He, who orchestrated my exit and grinned as he passed me the folder like a death sentence. Now he wanted me to help him pick up the pieces of the glass he had shattered with his own bare hands. I stood, slowly, and walked to where he was standing. For a second, I looked him over, really looked at him. There was no fire left. No arrogance. No power. He was just a man who had finally learned that the people you climb over on the way up can also drag you down when the time comes. You don't need a job, Greg, I said calmly. You need a lesson. His eyes hardened. Is that what this was? A punishment? I didn't blink. No, this was balance. I turned and walked back to my desk. You spent 2 decades making people feel small. You taught me that loyalty is expendable, That value is invisible unless someone else claims it. So, I did exactly what you taught me to do. He didn't reply. He just stood there, breathing heavily through clenched teeth like he wanted to scream, but knew it wouldn't change anything. And it wouldn't. Nothing he said would fix what he'd broken. Not the firm. Not the trust. Not his future. I'll find something else, he said at last, forcing a weak laugh. I always do. I gave him a small, cold smile. Maybe. But not here. Not with me. He opened his mouth to say something else, but I was already turning back to my computer. The meeting was over, and he knew it. After a long pause, I heard the door click shut behind him. That night, I sat alone in my office long after the sun dipped below the skyline, watching the lights stretch out across the city like veins under skin. I thought about how close I'd come to walking out quietly, how easy it would have been to let him win, to shrink into the background and let someone else take the fall. But I didn't. And now, for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving someone else's empire. I was building my own. Greg was done. His board had cut him out. His name was smeared across every financial blog and industry forum. Clients were actively celebrating their exits. Internally, Carter Associates was hemorrhaging. Layoffs were coming. Morale was dead. And I was just getting started. The news didn't stop for days. Every trade newsletter, every regional business outlet, every single firm whisper network was talking. Greg's departure was public, loud, and laced with the kind of failure you don't come back from. The spin doctors tried their best, called it a leadership shift, claimed it was a long-term strategic exit, but no one bought it. The writing was spray-painted across the walls. His name no longer opened doors. It warned people away like a quarantine notice. Meanwhile, I was doing exactly what I promised myself I would, building something new that didn't rely on fragile egos or impossible loyalty tests. Julian brought me fully into the senior partner circle within 3 weeks. The clients I had moved over weren't just staying, they were thriving under our strategy. My name carried weight now, not because someone else attached it to theirs, but because I'd finally taken control of where it was going. One Monday morning, I stepped into our downtown office, coffee in hand, hair tied back, ready to start the day. My assistant handed me a folder of onboarding reports and mentioned a few high-priority emails waiting in my inbox. I barely sat down before she returned, this time her expression unreadable. "There's someone in the lobby asking to speak with you," she said carefully. I raised an eyebrow. "Who?" She hesitated, then said it. "It's Greg." I blinked once, took a slow breath, and nodded. "Send him up." When he walked through the door, it was like looking at a shadow version of someone I used to know. His posture had changed, shoulders a little slouched, no swagger in his step, eyes flickering like he wasn't sure where to look. He didn't offer a handshake. He just stood across from my desk, clutching a worn leather briefcase that looked older than I remembered. "I won't take up much of your time," he began, voice subdued. I wanted to say something. Maybe it won't mean anything now, but it should have come sooner. I watched him closely, waiting. "I was wrong about you," he continued. "I took you for granted. I dismissed what you did because I thought it made me look strong. But it didn't. It just made me blind." I didn't speak. I let him continue, because this time he didn't get to dictate the pace of the conversation. "When everything fell apart," he said, "I told myself it wasn't my fault, that the market was shifting, that clients were overreacting. But the truth is, I failed. I was the one who set the fire, then acted surprised when the house burned down." A long silence stretched between us. I kept my face neutral, unreadable, even as a dozen versions of myself over the last 20 years flashed through my head. Tired, overlooked, dismissed, doubted. That woman wasn't standing here anymore. "I don't expect forgiveness," he added. "I just needed to say it out loud." For the first time in the conversation, I spoke. "I didn't need an apology," I said quietly. "What I needed was respect. But I learned how to live without it. And now, I don't need anything from you at all." He looked like he might cry, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't cruel. I just wasn't interested in performing empathy for a man who had only learned value through loss. "I wish I'd listened sooner," he whispered. "I wish I hadn't wasted so much time." "So do I replied. "But here we are." He turned to leave, hesitated, then glanced back. "You're good at this," he said. "All of it. And I see that now." I nodded once. I always was. He left without another word, and when the door clicked shut behind him, I exhaled slowly. Not because I was angry or sad or relieved, but because it finally felt like the page had turned. Weeks passed. I stopped hearing his name altogether. Carter Associates rebranded under interim leadership, but they never recovered. Their losses had been too public, too dramatic, and their competitors, including us, moved in fast. What used to be a dominant name in the market had now become a warning story taught to interns. Don't burn the people who build your foundations. As for me, I kept climbing. I led 3 major account expansions, mentored a new cohort of talent, and began speaking at conferences for the first time in my career. One afternoon, Julian approached me after a meeting and said, "You know, people are starting to call you the woman who took down Carter Associates." I just smiled. "No," I said. "I'm the woman who finally stopped cleaning up their messes." Late one Friday night, long after everyone else had gone home, I stood by the windows of my office with a glass of wine and looked out over the city lights. My reflection stared back at me, not a survivor, not a footnote in someone else's legacy, but the author of my own story. I thought about that night I got the video, sitting in my kitchen, blindsided and humiliated. I thought about all the years I stayed silent, thinking that loyalty was something noble and permanent. But I knew better now. Loyalty given to the wrong people is just another word for self-erasure. I raised my glass slightly toward the empty skyline, not as a toast to vengeance or victory, but to the version of myself who finally chose freedom over fear. She's the one who won.